I think it's worthwhile, before we delve into some of the issues in a little bit more detail, to just reflect on the significance of services for the US economy. Some of this was outlined by Stefan in his remarks. We know that approximately 7% of US GDP comprises services, and increasingly a lot of these services are being traded. Part of this is the successes of previous trade liberalising outcomes in the WTO and in trade agreements. It also reflects, I think, technological development, specifically the growth and the globalisation of the internet, the capacity to move data globally, and how this has enabled a whole range of services to increasingly be traded online. So we can think about this both in terms of the ability to sell directly to consumers, but also, I think, as significantly, if not more, businesses increasingly can use tools such as cloud computing to access software. We think about telecommunications, and financial services can increasingly be provided online. It's also, I think, worth underlining the point that Stefan made, that the United States runs an increasingly significant surplus in services trade, which was around about $220 billion last year. We also know, I just want to draw out this point from Stefan's remarks, that services are important in and of themselves, and they're traded, but they also are used to produce goods, which are then also exported. So if we think about the value added of services and what that means in terms of exports, while services themselves comprise approximately 1/3 of US exports, if you also take into account services embodied in goods which are then exported, services are actually well over 50% of total US exports. And at the same time, we also see that the most significant barriers to trade actually are in the services sector. The OECD has done a whole lot of work on this issue. I just want to highlight some recent work on logistics, because we've got Laura here, that identifies very high levels of barriers to logistics services across the globe, often actually in a lot of countries in Asia which are not necessarily yet party to the TPP, such as in China, in India, in Indonesia. And I mention that because it underscores that the TPP is an opportunity to expand this into a broader trade agreement. And so when we think about the importance of the TPP for services, I think it's also worth keeping in mind the range of countries which potentially could join this agreement. We've got a range of experts on the panel today, and I'm sure they're familiar to all of you in the audience today. You've all got your bios in front of you, so I'm not going to read out that in detail. We've got Christine Bliss, who formerly, until very recently, was at USTR and was one of the lead negotiators on various aspects of the services negotiations for TPP. Laura Lane, who's now President for Global Public Affairs at UPS, and so we've got one of the key sort of services drivers of the global economy, and Brad Jensen from Georgetown University, who's done some very excellent seminal work on services trade. So we've got a lot to talk about today. I think we'll just go down the panel in terms of comments. Christine, I'll leave it up to you.
Well, thanks very much, Josh. And I'd like to thank WITA for inviting me to come and speak today about the importance of services and the impact of the TPP agreement on the services industry in particular. I think as we've heard this morning, and I think it's worth emphasizing, the United States is the most competitive supplier of international services. And at CSI, we recently released our annual analysis of services exports, which revealed that in 2014, US companies exported more than $680 billion worth in services, resulting in a services surplus, as Josh said, of nearly $250 billion. CSI also found in its survey that 46 states each exported more than $1 billion in services in 2014, which I think is a very, very positive statistic, just the degree of the level of participation at the state, at the local level, in the importance of growing services exports. Services is by far the largest source of jobs, output, and economic growth in the U.S. They account for 8 out of 10 U.S. jobs, and since 2006, U.S. services exports have grown by 74%. We think that's a pretty startling statistic. If you look at just the last 8 years, a 74% growth rate. Services are enablers of all aspects of the economy, from manufacturing, agriculture, energy. All of these areas depend on services in areas such as banking, insurance, logistics, engineering, and communications to achieve their production and income goals. At the center of services global growth is the expanding use of data and digital tools, most notably the internet, to conduct business. A critical part of our mission at CSI is to ensure that international rules and provisions governing trade and services keep up with the pace of technological change and innovation. And I think the discussion of TPP is a very good illustration of that, because we do feel that there have been a number of areas where there have been very, very important steps forward. Now, while the United States is the world's leading services exporter, it still has tremendous scope to growth. And for example, although services account for almost 80% of value added in the U.S. economy, it only accounts for about 30% of U.S. trade. Now, the TPP can clearly help U.S. services trade by expanding U.S. companies' access to markets with its collective population of over 480 million and a GDP of almost 11 trillion. As I said, the TPP includes a number of provisions that are vital for supporting trade in the digital age, and I'd like to highlight a few, some of which you've heard this morning, but I think, again, they deserve emphasis. First of all, across the services and the investment area, as was mentioned earlier, we approach the negotiations, and they're founded on a negative list basis, which is critically important and an innovation we've seen in our previous FTAs, but the fact that we've now replicated that across all 12 countries in this agreement, I think, is a very, very important innovation. The cross-border services chapter itself creates binding disciplines for fair and open cross-border trade and services, including the principle of national treatment, MFN, and a prohibition on requiring specific types of juridical entities on the part of foreign service providers. And it also prohibits a local presence requirement as a condition of supplying the service. In addition, countries cannot maintain measures that impose limits on the number of suppliers, the value of services, or even the number of services operations or the total quantity of services outputs. As was mentioned, the cross-border services has a critically important annex on logistics and express delivery, which requires that the current level as of the date of signing of market access be maintained. And I think that that is a very, very important, really, beachhead that's established for this critical U.S. service industry. And it also redounds to the benefit of SMEs. So many of them depend on the express delivery industry to really deliver their services in an efficient and timely manner. Another area of critical achievement in the TPP is the e-commerce chapter, with the exception, of course, of the carve-out for financial services, which has been highlighted this morning. The e-commerce chapter ensures that electronically delivered services are treated equally to those delivered conventionally. The chapter provides the first ever binding disciplines on the free flow of data across borders and prohibits the requirement of local servers. Together, these requirements will allow companies to offer cloud computing and other internet-based services. The e-commerce chapter, very importantly, also requires that parties establish a framework for protecting the transfer of personal information. And one reason why this is so important is that fights over privacy and concerns over the protection of personal information have been one of the major impediments to the free flow of information. So the fact that the TPP acknowledges this and has this requirement for establishing a framework is a very significant step forward. The TPP also calls for countries to cooperate on cybersecurity. And security concerns and cybersecurity is another major impediment to the cross-border delivery of data flows. And the fact that, again, it's a step forward. It's a call for cooperation. We may not be as binding and as specific as some would like, but nonetheless, a very important step forward. The financial services chapter also includes some very important provisions that will enhance the growth of services trade. For example, it has strong binding disciplines on postal entities selling insurance. And what it does is it ensures that we establish a level playing field for U.S. insurance suppliers competing against postal entities in the insurance business by requiring that parties not provide them with preferential treatment in terms of use of postal outlets and also having an independent regulator. The TPP Financial Services Chapter, for the first time, also requires that all TPP parties provide for the free flow of electronic payment services on a cross-border basis, which is critical for the provision of credit and debit services, since U.S. credit and debit companies have their services located in the United States. So it's critical that they be able to supply those services on a cross-border basis, are also critical to the delivery of critical U.S. infrastructure services. TPP is the first trade agreement that will extend pro-competitive network access rules to mobile suppliers. And this will close an important loophole that has enabled mobile suppliers in certain markets to corner the market on an unfair basis. And so these disciplines will now apply to these mobile suppliers and end that unfair practice. The investment provisions in TPP will also have a positive impact on services. As was noted, services account for 40% of U.S. investment. I think this is a point that's often overlooked. We often just focus on the cross-border aspect of services, but investment is equally important. And so the investment chapter, with its core obligations of national treatment, minimum standard of treatment, MFN, its barring of performance requirements, is also critically important, particularly because the performance requirements address things like technology transfer, the requirement to use local technologies, and these are particularly pernicious practices that relate to the state-owned entities that are distorting competition in TPP markets. TPP is also the first ever agreement to establish disciplines for state-owned enterprises in a very comprehensive way. And these include non-discriminatory rules that apply to purchases, commercial purchases and sales of SOEs wherever they operate in the TPP area. And this is an important advancement. Certainly, one of the key benefits that has been achieved for TPP is that it prohibits countries overall, by the collection of provisions that I've mentioned, from blocking the cross-border flow of data over the internet, and with the exception of financial services, prohibits countries from enforcing localization requirements. TPP has made advances in addressing the frequent and broad use of digital technologies by the companies today, ever more prolific, and has facilitated their provision. However, there are a few provisions that can be improved in the future. While the majority of services suppliers in the non-financial services area will benefit from prohibited localization requirements, the financial services sector is not provided with this protection. And this is a serious oversight. There are real security concerns about the integrity of the data flows if forced server localization is enforced in financial services areas. So this is an area where we definitely need to see improvement. In addition, the SOE disciplines, although comprehensive, can be improved. For example, SOE ownership is defined in terms of 50% government ownership, and we would like to see that requirement improved. So while there are certain gaps remain, we clearly acknowledge that there is tremendous potential for benefit in services trade. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion this morning.